Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Thrilled to be sitting down today with Marden Nichols, and we're going to be talking about their new book, How to Make a Home, An Ancient Guide to Style and Comfort. Dr. Marden Nichols comes to us from Georgetown University, but previously came from the city that we record from, Baltimore, Maryland. She worked there amongst many other places at the Walters Art Museum. And it's such a cool book in that it takes a look at something that is in some ways kind of foreign to us, which is sort of the ancient home and what we can learn from the ancient home, and the way in which Romans and to some extent the Greeks, but the ancient world lived. And I'm excited to sit down and chat with you about this book. We'll have a link in the show notes so that people can pick it up and get it. And I think it's a cool story. I was telling Marden before we hit record that at first I was like, I'm not sure if there's a real strong preservation connection here when we were taking a look at the book. And then when I read it, and I try and read everything that we broadcast on, I was like, oh, this is totally a preservation story in just the way in which obviously we know about some of these places, and we'll talk about that because of the preservation and the archaeology that's been done. But also it's sort of a story about how to organize your life and what works and what doesn't based on sort of our understanding of history. So it's a great preservation story that we're excited to bring here, and one that goes a little bit further back than some of the preservation stories we previously talk about. We're going back several thousand years today. But before we get to all that, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So Marden, where did you grow up, and what led you to this deep interest in ancient literature, art, architecture? How did you get so fascinated by this?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Nick. It's great to be here. I am from Baltimore. I grew up in the city, and my love of literature, art, and architecture really comes out of that context. The schools that I went to, the Calvert School and Bryn Mawr School, were both really enriching places where learning about literature and history and art was really foregrounded. Bryn Mawr School had as its first headmistress Edith Hamilton, who wrote The Greek Way and a popular book on mythology. So I had the opportunity to take ancient Greek and Latin languages in school. And then, of course, as we all know, Baltimore is a fantastic museum city. And so a lot of my earliest memories are going to the Baltimore Museum of Art, see the Cone Collection, and going to the Walters Art Museum with my mom. We're so lucky now these museums are free, but decades ago, there was one free day a week. And so I just remember the excitement of waiting for the free day. And it was such a gift to grow up in an environment where there's just history everywhere in the fabric of the city. So this all comes out of that.
I love that. And I love that you're like a poster child for why all of these institutions do their work, because we're like, someday there will be people who will come along and they'll study this, and there's such an importance to making these investments, and then you basically just make the case for all of that. You're like a walking billboard for why cultural institutions should exist. So, but how do you make the jump? Of course, I mean, you're into it, you're taking ancient languages. How do you make the jump from that to that being your true career?
Well, something that I saw as moving beyond the classroom when I was in high school, with a group of friends, we went down to London Town Historic Site in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and we were volunteering at the public house, the archaeological site there, and just kind of sifting through with a screen all of the dirt from the dig and finding the little bits of brick. And I thought, wow, I really can get very excited over very little. And that continued in college and in graduate school, just always wanting to learn more about the past and moving deeper and deeper into the ancient past. And so I've had a career in which I've been able to teach students and also work in museums. And that's kind of how it all came to be.
And tell people what you're doing now at Georgetown and how that presented the opportunity to work on this book.
So at Georgetown, I'm the chair of the classics department. And as part of that, I teach classes on Latin literature and on Roman art and architecture. And I got interested in writing this book because my colleague in the department, the historian Josiah Osgood, was writing books for this series that were using the writings of Suetonius to understand how to be a bad emperor was the title of that book. And then a book drawing from Cicero about how to stop a conspiracy. So he had been writing books for this series and saw an opportunity to do one that would have more to do with architecture and preservation. And he recommended me to the series editor.
It's really cool in that I guess we should maybe talk about the book. Maybe you give it a synopsis, your pitch for people who might want to pick this up and read it. It's really approachable. Like I was concerned at first when I was reviewing it. Like I've read a lot of Stoic sort of texts and kind of gotten deep into that. But for somebody who doesn't have a background in ancient or the ancient literature or classics, I was sort of at first like, okay, am I going to be able to kind of handle this? But I love that you kind of introduce each topic and kind of explain a little bit about this. How did you decide to break it up and maybe give people an idea of what they'll see when they open this book? And then we can kind of get into it a little bit.
So the series is called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers, and the idea is to be the kind of approachable book for a broad audience that you can dip into or you can read start to finish. You can come into it with very little knowledge about the ancient world and find things that are applicable to your life. It's meant to be a kind of tongue-in-cheek self-help series, taking the wisdom of the ancients and presenting it today. So the book is funny, it's informative, and it has some real wisdom in it that I hope will be very thought-provoking. It's a compendium of passages from different ancient authors. There are 19 passages from 11 authors. These are poets, prose authors, orators, architects. Some of the names of the authors who are represented in the volume will be more familiar, like Cicero, Ovid, Seneca, but other names are unfamiliar even to some people who work on the ancient world. So people like Bibaculus, a poet of the 1st century BC. Each of the passages in the volume, some of which are just a paragraph long, is introduced with a usually funny little tagline suggesting how this wisdom relates to our life today. And then there is an introduction that gives that context that allows you to see what kind of work the passage is coming out of and how the cultural context shapes the understanding of houses that derives from it. Because all of the passages in the book are built around this theme of domestic design, decoration, and what it meant for the ancient Romans.
Yeah, I thought it was really helpful. I mean, the practical side of this is I thought it was really helpful where you go in, I think it's early in the book, and you start talking about this is sort of what these homes were like. And it's remarkably different and similar, which is kind of cool. Like there's some things that you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of, we like that. Like that's sort of a modern feel, and then there's like, whoa, there's like these, what was it? Like the couches that they lay on. And like, there's like, okay, so that's kind of, but then there's this sort of like there's some strange things. And I thought one of the things that was interesting, and we'll talk about sort of the tongue in cheek stuff. You have potential for doing some comedy writing. We've interviewed some comedic writers, and I like the tongue in cheek stuff in there. We'll talk about that in a second. But I thought it was interesting about the difference between public and private space and how much of that was wrapped up into these homes as well. I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit, because from a preservation standpoint, that's unique, something that I don't think everybody would be as familiar with. They had very specific places, but they were all kind of intertwined in these houses with between like their public and their private spaces. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because I think that's interesting.
Yes. So while today you might think that for someone to walk into your house required a pretty formal invitation, in ancient Rome, the kind of large and grand elite homes that are mostly what the authors in this book have in mind were open to the public. There were open doors, often with enslaved people standing near them to kind of direct traffic in some way, but with the idea in mind that the owner of the house was going to entertain various kinds of people towards various different aims within his home. So people would be coming into houses along the street in a city or a town within the Roman Empire with the aim of conducting business, making formal and informal social calls, but also doing things like political networking or discussing commercial activities. The idea of a home office is really central here, that as you walked into an ancient Roman townhouse, it opened out into an atrium, so an area with an open roof that allowed light and air to come in to the home, and also rainwater that was collected in a basin below. And beyond this atrium, from what we understand from the text, the homeowner would be seated waiting for all kinds of clients of different kinds to come and visit him. So that idea of leaving home and going to the office was not within their mindset for people of that class and gender and station.
Which I think it's interesting if you're like more familiar with American history. There's some parallels there to what life was like during like the colonial period in the United States.
Yes.
You think about like a Mount Vernon. I mean, these are like grand homes, but like a Mount Vernon, they were constantly receiving guests and visitors and people trying to do business or coming to the Washingtons. They were putting people up all the time. There was not as profound a barrier between public and private space in a place like that as there is today. It seems like at some point we became very focused on this being the private domain, and you don't come into
Yes.
it.
Yes. Yeah, it is. There is a shallowness to that understanding of the house as private, right? That across many cultures and many periods, the home is not divorced from public space. I think that's a great point.
Now, I think the other thing that you mentioned and you sort of hit on just now is you said, from what we know, from what the texts kind of either provide or from, because you're drawing not only in this, you mentioned it a couple different times, not only on the text, but then on archaeology as well. So how strong is our understanding of the ancient world? I mean, are there still I think a lot of people would be like, yeah, of course we know everything about the Greeks and the Romans. Like how much more could we possibly need to know? But this suggests, and that there's still a lot of active scholarship going on just to understand the basics of life then.
That's absolutely right. And it's one of the disadvantages of the symbolic potency of the Roman house, that can sometimes obscure our literal understanding of what went on when, by which I mean that when ancient authors write about houses in these passages that I collect in the book, they're not just talking about the house, they're trying to make a more metaphorical claim about the person who owns the house. They had a very strong idea that the house reflected its owner. And so descriptions of houses and activities going on in houses are used as a way of communicating philosophical ideas or moral convictions. And so sometimes when we take this textual record that's so symbolic, that's so abstract, that's so crafted to make points to convince people of certain modes of behavior, we can read it literally and think, oh, this is how they lived, this is how they acted, right? And we get into trouble in that respect because the authors are trying to advance certain agendas. They're not trying to give us a textbook to read in 2025 and say, like, oh, that's how they organize the space.
Yeah, I got that sense of the agenda. I think there's one, and forgive me, I don't remember the exact passage, but there's one where you talk about where they're kind of like it's like tongue in cheek from then. They're kind of making fun of somebody, and you're using that passage to talk about some of the things that they're seeing in that space, but obviously understanding some of this is satire. And it sort of struck me as like, if you were to use, I don't know, like a sitcom like Roseanne from the 80s or 90s, and you were like, well, this is what every American home was like in 1991, and it's like they must have all had these giant quilts that they threw over their couches, and, and it's like, oh no, like some did, but that was a sort of a jab at a certain type of people, and Roseanne was doing some of that cynically with satire or whatever sitcom you want to use. That was just one that came to mind, because it's very centered on a house, and so you get a little bit of that in there as well. And obviously, you just kind of have to use a diversity of passages to kind of get a bigger picture of what life was like then. And I'm curious what the collection process was like, because presumably your study was not aimed before all of this about just the home place. I don't know if that's true or not. So how did you decide what you were going to select? Did you just had to kind of think about passages you had read previously that talked about houses and structures, or how did you do that kind of survey?
Well, I have been really interested in Roman domestic architecture for a long time. And so a lot of these passages were ones that I had come across just in my reading over the decades. And it was very exciting to have new discoveries, things I hadn't yet encountered, and see all of the through lines that connected texts I was more familiar with, including the works of Vitruvius, who's the only surviving author who dedicated a work completely to architecture from the ancient world. He was a primary focus of my previous research. And then through the process of pulling together the passages for this book, I was noticing more and more, because I was trying to work with authors like Seneca, like Cicero, who are having kind of a moment right now, with interest in Seneca, interest in popular philosophy. And so for me, the work was trying to forge those links between philosophical authors and the more technical authors that had preoccupied me more in the past.
Yeah, because as just a popular reader of some of these texts like you're describing, I had never come across Vitruvius, but it kind of, it adds, I think what's cool about this for someone who just has maybe a passing interest or has read some Stoic texts or is just interested in this time period, is that it paints a much richer picture with some stuff that you probably wouldn't come across if you were just sort of doing a cursory, unless you're like a deep professional like yourself who studies this sort of things. You don't come across it. And what I think is really cool about it too, what I enjoyed about it, is that you actually have the texts there too. So you sort of explain them and tell people what they're going to see, and then you throw it all out there. So you really get to read it. I'm curious, the text that you included, did you do original translations of those? Or I know that classicists are very specific about the translations that
Yeah.
they use. Talk to me about the translations. Did you do them yourself? Where do you go back to? How did that all come together?
Yes. So one of the features of this series is that all the books contain entirely new translations of the works. And so a lot of my labor to create the volume was not just selecting the passages, but creating new translations that I hope will be really appealing to our 21st century ears. Some of these texts, the most available translations are decades old, and that adds a layer of remove for a world that's already so distant from our own. You can wonder in the year 2025, when we've got Google Translate and all of these texts, right? I'm not translating anything that hadn't been translated out of Latin or Greek into English before. What is the point of continuing to create new translations? But the voice across all of these 11 different authors is so different, is so distinct. And the challenge of trying to imagine, as a translator, one of the things, kind of tricks in the toolbox is to try to imagine, well, who would be kind of a contemporary analog, someone who kind of reminds you of this ancient figure, and you try to put yourself into the shoes of that author and kind of recreate their voice. And that was something that I found really enjoyable, but also kind of exhausting, because friends of mine who'd done books in this series, they'd focused on one author and really had that ability to fully invest in imagining that persona. Whereas for me, it was rapid cycling through all of these different authors, some of whom I was just translating for a paragraph. But I attained a familiarity with, an intimacy with the differences in the Latin and then the Greek for the one of these authors that I really had not had before. Because as you're saying, as a classicist, we're constantly working with translations. It's part of the career. When you publish scholarly articles and books, nowadays, you always include a little English translation of whatever passage you're reproducing in the text. But oftentimes we just go as literal as possible, and people don't really think too much about the English translation that they're providing. They're just trying to get in and get out with it. So this was a totally different skill for me, and something that I really want to do more of, because it was a great way to approach the text in a totally different way.
Yeah. Well, no, that makes a lot of sense now that you say that, because I have some old copy of meditations that I've picked up,
Yes.
and it's it can be tough to kind of get through sometimes, and this is much breezier. So
Yes.
you need to work on that one next. So we'll have you back when you no big deal, right? And it's there must be some, speaking of no big deal, there must be some weight to being okay, I'm going to translate Seneca. I don't know,
Yes.
to me that's saying you're going to work on something associated with Washington, or I mean that's some heavy stuff. That's the you're in the classic big leagues there, I think, when you start doing that. Speaking of the tongue-in-cheek stuff, I was going to say my favorite one is Prime Real Estate Won't Solve All Your Problems, which is a Seneca one.
Yes.
I think that there's a lot of great advice in here, just sort of things that I think is common advice for the modern person, that some of it they might be familiar with, just a good house isn't going to make everything better. And there's a lot of other things like that. One question I was going to ask for the preservation community and for the architects listening who are designing new places, do you feel like there's anything in here about sustainability, about architecture? Is there something worth looking back at ancient design and trying to reinterpret for the modern audience? We're thinking a lot about resiliency in our buildings. So you're talking about buildings that capture water. That's kind of an interesting, there's a moment for that. There's a lot of people who think that rain barrels are a new cool thing. They're not that new, but that's something that we weren't doing for a long time. So there's things like that. I'm curious. I mean, I know that that's a little bit outside of the the comment of the book, but I'm curious, talk about how to make a home. What about literally how to make a home? Do you feel like there's something in here that we should be thinking about as, designers and professionals who are trying to reinterpret these sorts of things for a modern audience?
Yes, absolutely. And if you go and visit the surviving the surviving Roman townhouses and villas on the Bay of Naples in Italy in the summer, you will get it immediately because you're out there baking in the sun. And the moment you step inside these homes that are, now ruinous and thousands of years old, you feel the temperature drop. They were designing houses for the optimal circulation of light, air. They're thinking about temperature. They're thinking about the movement of people around the space. As you mentioned before, something a little bit outside of our experience is the fact that their furniture was all utterly movable. Just having a conversation with my sister yesterday about trying to move a couch, and you have to make sure you have all your personnel in place if you're going to move most modern American furniture around your home today. Whereas in an ancient context, a couch was something that was very light and movable. And this had to do with the fact that they did not have central air. They did not have a lot of temperature control. But they did think about which areas of the home were coolest in the summer and warmest in the winter. And they would move this furniture around the home. Rooms were more flexible in terms of, was it a bedroom or was it a sitting room? Was it a dining room? And so they not only were using materials and choosing layouts and designs that would allow the house to make best use of the local climate, but they also adapted the way that they use the house to do things in the most environmentally conscious way, without fully comprehending that idea as we understand it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the clear takeaway is that mid-century American design was sort of, we can build it however we want, and we'll pump enough cold or hot air into it, and then that'll be good. And now some of us who live in those types of homes are realizing, wow, this is extremely expensive to keep this place moderately comfortable. Maybe we should make it so that, or even in an office space, how many of us listening to this are in an office space that you can't open the window?
Yes.
Right, which is wild. It's a wild statement that there is no way to bring fresh air in without using some type of mechanical system to pump it in and out. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is there is something to be learned from the ancient world, or even from, you talk about London town, the 18th century world. It wasn't that long ago that this was still something that was part of design. And you also mentioned just now that two things I wanted to kind of follow up on, that you have visited and you've been in some of these places, and the distinction between townhomes and villas. So that's something that you bring up in the book. There's some great sketches in the book, or diagrams, however you want to call it, of these buildings. So I love that because I'm a visual guy and I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of get it. I see what she's talking about. So I love that you put that in there. And you dedicate some space to talking about difference between townhomes and villas. So I don't know if you maybe just want to mention that since you brought it up, and then we'll talk about the ones that you visited.
Yes. So townhouses and villas are the two major type of Roman house that are treated in the book. And I make that choice to talk about those two types of homes and not about huts where people were living in the countryside, not to talk about congested apartment buildings in Roman cities, all of which were a feature of the vast array of different forms of Roman homes. The townhouses and the villas, however, are what survive best in the Bay of Naples, in Italy, where the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD simultaneously destroyed and preserved this vast array of archaeological material, but also the authors, who are the main focus of the book, are really interested in how the townhouse and the villa are this dichotomy between business and leisure. So they associated the townhouse, which had this very formulaic layout, whereas I mentioned before, you come in, you've got the open atrium that has around it a series of smaller rooms, and then opens out at the back into a peristyle, so another open courtyard that has columns all around it and was filled with art and gardens. That townhouse was associated with business, the life in the city, the kind of daily grind, ancient Roman style. They had in their mind that the villa, which was a residence on a country estate, was the place of leisure, rest, relaxation, intellectual and cultural fulfillment. It was the place to vacation, to read, to enjoy the relationship between architecture and landscape. I mean, hidden behind that cultural ideal of the villa as the place of leisure is the fact that a lot of these villas are working farms where there are huge numbers of people who are not having a leisurely time of it, right? Who are enslaved, who are working the fields, who are making the villa profitable, making it into a kind of self-sustaining enterprise where people are eating fruits and vegetables that they've grown on the land. But yes, the villa, unlike the townhouse, which had this more recognizable architectural footprint, the villa was endlessly variable in the way that it was designed. And it really was meant to conform to the landscape, to be in dialogue with the landscape, to be this sort of open, breathing structure that created places to contemplate and enjoy nature. And so even the wall paintings in some of these villas will have depictions of gardens that on the wall that are very much like and are life size and very much like the gardens that are right outside the door. So the villa was the place to think about architecture and nature and dialogue.
Fascinating. You thought a lot about this. This is a great answer. I'm curious about your experience. I mean, obviously, you're a classicist who lives in the United States. So by its very nature, you need to get over there, it seems like,
Yes.
routinely, just to kind of experience it, get to use it and see the space. But which ones did you visit a number of these? Have you been in these places? What kind of experience have you physically had on the ground with what at least remains?
So I've been visiting Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the sites around the Bay of Naples for 23 years. I go back every few years at least. These are sites that are open to the public because of issues with preservation, because it is really difficult to maintain an open air archaeological site. Over the decades that I've been visiting the region, more and more, they've had to close a larger and larger segments of the archaeological sites because they just don't have the financing to maintain enough visitor access. But if you plan it right, if you go on the websites and check out which houses are open on which days, the Italian Cultural Ministry is really interested in ensuring that people get access to these ruins and that continues. The Naples Archaeological Museum is also a must if you're interested in looking at the remains of ancient Roman houses, because due to Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the other sites being open to the elements, a lot of the paintings, the movable objects, the furniture, the art has been located inside the Naples Archaeological Museum. So that is just a phenomenal collection where you can move room from room and just see everything that the archaeological sites are just kind of a shell preserved in time.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of just archaeology, I remember thinking back to some of the early courses I took on this stuff. I mean, this is sort of the beginning of modern archaeology as well. I mean,
Yes.
they were uncovering these things, and then that began to inspire Greek architecture and design, and it came at just the right time in sort of the history of the United States and other countries to inspire that sort of thing. So, it's a preservation story wrapped in a preservation story wrapped in a preservation story. It's a lot of fun. We need to PreserveCast is powered by Preservation Maryland, the statewide nonprofit, and it sounds like we need to get Dr. Nichols to take us on a tour of it at some point in the future.
I love that.
We'll organize that. And I guess the other question I have before we kind of conclude here is, yeah, it's tongue in cheek how to make a home, but there's a lot of really good actual advice in here and just sort of reminders. Some of it just like if you're interested in some of these ancient texts for philosophy or whatever it might be, there's just as much here for thinking about how we treat the spaces in which we live and what we think about them and how we think that they reflect on us and how we reflect on them. I'm curious, you, Marden Nichols, do you feel like this has impacted the way that you live now?
That is a great question. I think, one of the elements that I have thought about more and more after working on the book is historic homes, because one of the passages from Seneca that appears in the book, he goes to the home of Scipio Africanus. And so this is already a historic home, hundreds of years old during Seneca's time. And it allows him to contemplate the lives of the people, and particularly Scipio, who lived there, and the ways in which Scipio is a model for virtue and the distance between Scipio's time and his own time. And I live here in Washington, D.C., right near Dumbarton Oaks Museum and Gardens. And I think oftentimes in the race to kind of find artifacts to display or experiences to have in these historic homes, we kind of lose the opportunity sometimes to make those connections between the individuals and how these houses were received at their time as representations of the people. So I think I've certainly been, as I kind of go around DC, visiting historic homes, I definitely think more about the owners rather than just saying, oh, well, this is the first room where they've got the pictures of the people who live there, and just kind of move on. I think a lot more about that now.
That's fascinating. No, it's great. Well, the book is called How to Make a Home, an Ancient Guide to Style and Comfort from Vitruvius and Guests, selected, translated, and introduced by Marden Fitzpatrick Nichols. We've enjoyed having the opportunity to chat with you. I'm curious, what's next for you? Where are you headed next? Back to more scholarly texts, or is there going to be something else popularly fun out there for us to read?
Right now, I'm very deep into a scholarly project, which is about the connections between theater and painting in ancient Rome, and how the Romans thought about theater as an art form as being a kind of form of painting in motion. And they were thinking about the ways in which theater and painting were both arts that dealt with illusion and deception. So I'm deep into that. But yes, writing something for a broader audience has been so invigorating and illuminating for me, for my own life, that I definitely want to do more of that in the future as well.
Well, you have a knack for it, so you should, because it's really well written. And obviously, I said we'll put a link in the notes so people can pick it up. I'm curious. We always ask people about their favorite historic place or site. And it doesn't have to be a Roman villa or townhome. We've given that a lot of time already. Do you have a place that you could just keep going back to that still captures you?
Wow. One place I'm really looking forward to going to again is the Colosseum in Rome. I think I've been teaching the Colosseum a lot recently, and just the fact that there is today that sort of underwhelming sense when people see the majesty of the exterior, then they walk in the interior, there's not as much that survives. But in fact, the very absence of a lot of preservation of architecture in the interior of the Colosseum allows you to see that different architectural teams were at work because you're looking at some of the substructures. I really want to get back there now that I've spent a lot of time thinking about it in my teaching and just kind of experience that in the space, because there's always that wonderful dialectic between spending time preparing for a visit to a historic site and then what is your experience being inside of it.
Yeah, well, we'll do that on the trip we plan with you. How about that?
Perfection.
This has been so much fun. Loved the book and appreciate the opportunity to sit down and chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marden.
Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.